For all its beauty and splendor, the wilderness can be a cruel teacher. Everest is not only a mountain, it is a graveyard of adventurous men and women who believed they could conquer it. People die on Everest because they believe it owes them something: glory, accomplishment, a sense of purpose. But Everest owes you nothing. It collects debts instead. The trail to the summit is lined with the frozen bodies of courageous individuals who believed they were strong and well prepared for this arduous ascent. They stare back at you with empty eyes, reminders that even courage is not enough. Let's venture back to the savage wilderness where survival is earned, not given. This is outdoor disasters. For Lincoln Hall, his Mount Everest ascent would be a harrowing tale of survival. Mount Everest, the highest place on Earth. The holy grail for climbers is a mountain that calls to the most adventurous people worldwide. And for an Australian Lincoln Hall, it was an obsession, a calling. He'd been dreaming of Everest since the 1980s, driven by a fever that had only grown with time. Climbing became his life's compass, guiding him through years of hardship, propelling him higher with every summit. Lincoln Ross Hall was a veteran Australian mountaineer. Long ago, Everest was formed when two giant pieces of Earth's crust smashed into each other, pushing rocks higher and higher until they touched the sky. Over thousands of years, it grew taller and taller, becoming the towering giant we know today. It's part of a Himalayas mountain range between Nepal and China. At 29,032 feet or 8,848 meters above sea level, Everest soars higher than the typical cruising altitude of commercial airliners. Climbing Everest is a big challenge that takes lots of training and special equipment like oxygen tanks and warm clothes. Climbers must also deal with strong winds, freezing temperatures, and slippery ice. But for the people who make it to the top, it's an amazing achievement. Lincoln Hall was born on December 19, 1955 in Canberra. He was a fierce adventurer who loved climbing mountains. Lincoln was also an author and philanthropist. Forging a new route, Lincoln was a member of the first Australian expedition to reach Mount Everest in 1984. They successfully created a new climbing route on Everest. But those 22 years ago, before his latest attempt, he came within 1,500 feet of Everest's peak, only to be turned back because of the dangerous mountain conditions. Coming down to base camp, disappointment hit him like a poison. He couldn't shake it. It lingered, a dark shadow on his soul. Now, at 50, with a wife and 2 sons, he knew this was his last chance. He could not fail this time. The stakes were higher, yet the years had softened his body. He replaced youthful strength with resolve. It would be his mind that carried him up this mountain this time around. On May 25, 2006, it's close to midnight, and Lincoln prepares to leave with his Sherpa guides from Everest Camp 4, facing 1,800 vertical feet, or 550 meters in the biting night air. This was Everest's death zone, where oxygen waned, and each step took pieces from a man. Lincoln knew the cost. 10 climbers had died this season alone, but as the stars burned above, a fierce joy stirred in him, urging him onward. This was the mountain, his moment. His friend Mike Dillon, waiting at base camp, prayed for his safe return. They'd been through many climbs, but this one was different. It was Everest. As dawn's light touched the slopes, he reached the second step, the last barrier between him and the summit. There, with stars fading and the Earth's curve visible beneath him, Lincoln felt an energy he thought was lost to age. And as he crested the summit, he felt a surge of joy, the weight of decades falling away. The world stretched below, endless and beautiful. 25 years of dreaming, and he was finally here. He called down to Mike, his voice steady, filled with calm. But Mike's voice, warm with pride, held a reminder. Remember, mate, you're only halfway there. Lincoln knew the mountain wasn't conquered by reaching the top. It was conquered by making it down. Every climber knew this, though few heeded it. At 8,848 meters, there is no mercy. The summit was reached, the flag planted, the photographs taken. For Hall, it should have been enough. But Everest has a way of deciding when enough has been taken. As the climbers turned back, clouds began to gather on the horizon, gray and ominous. Descending, Hall began to falter. He gasped, his hands trembling with the dread certainty of oxygen starvation. Hall's Sherpa, Dorje, saw it first. The glassy stare of a man being unmade by the altitude. The symptoms came rapidly: confusion, exhaustion, hallucinations. High-altitude cerebral edema, the silent killer of climbers, had claimed another victim. His body was shutting down, the altitude taking its toll, his brain swelling from lack of oxygen. Cerebral edema, it pressed against the brain with nowhere to go. First it took your sense, then your life. Is he talking? Is he making sense? The radio crackled with questions, but they knew the truth. Cerebral edema could kill you in an instant or drag you slowly to the edge. And there, near the summit of Everest, no one could save Lincoln. Even the strongest couldn't carry a man down from that altitude. Helicopters could rescue men from the sea, from jungles, from canyons, but Everest was different. It left men for dead. In 50 years, more than 200 bodies had been left scattered near the peak. Then, a glimmer of awareness flickered through him. Lincoln came to, suddenly realizing where he was. Everest. Some part of him understood that he had to move to get down quickly, but his strength had slipped away. The pressure on his brain stole his control, making each movement foreign and disconnected. He stumbled slowly, barely managing to walk, forcing each leg forward like a man pushing through sand. When he reached the second step, that sheer rock face at 28,000 feet, it became a test of will, a place where more than a few climbers had met their end. His mind slipped again, drifting, confused. He saw a Sherpa nearby and wondered why he was there. Then he remembered. The Sherpa's climber had just died. The news struck him like a hammer, a shock sharp enough to make him want to let go, to fall. He looked down and felt the call of that 11,000-foot drop. Maybe that was it. A voice cut through the haze, clear and firm over the radio. "Base camp, do you read me?" Mike Dillon's voice, calm but stern, reached through the fog in Lincoln's mind. Put the radio to Lincoln's ear. His friend was there, speaking directly to him. "Lincoln, mate, it's Mike." That familiar voice steadied him, brought him back to himself. Halfway down, a fresh wave of fear took hold. Voices crowded his mind, filling him with dread. He was sure he wouldn't make it. And then, silence. A sudden, peaceful stillness. He looked around and saw the late afternoon light painting the mountains, a strange calm wrapping around him. For a moment, he forgot the pain, forgot the fear, and felt only awe. Then the adrenaline hit, and he pushed on. The Sherpas saw his rally and pressed him harder, urging him to keep moving. Time was slipping. Oxygen was low. Each second felt stolen, a gamble with life, until Lincoln's strength gave out completely. He collapsed, and they checked him over. He didn't stir. They pressed his eye, but he was gone. They knew what he knew. Cerebral edema at that height was a death sentence. They'd done everything, but there was no more to give. With quiet prayers, they took what they could for his family, gathered his belongings, and turned back, leaving him to the mountain. At base camp, Mike Dillon heard the news. Lincoln was gone. His friend, a man who had been his partner in so many climbs, was now just a voice on the radio, lost to Everest. Mike was the one to make the call to tell Lincoln's wife. The hours passed, and somehow Lincoln woke. Alone on the slope without gear or shelter, he was alive. Dazed, he looked for his pack, only to remember it had been taken for his family. Night had settled in, the cold already sinking deep. It would be easy to drift off, to let go, to let the numbness take over. But something in him refused. He rocked his body to keep awake, to fight off the cold. The night on Everest's north face was an unrelenting void. The winds howled, battering the mountain and all who dared linger on its icy slopes. For Lincoln Hall, the cold was a force that seeped into his very core, shutting down the systems of his body with mechanical precision. Blood slowed, muscle fibers stiffened, and thought began to splinter, fracturing into shards of memory and hallucination. Hall's position was precarious. He sat slumped near the exposed ridge, his climbing gear a fragile barrier against the killing frost. His downsuit, designed for survival in extreme cold, was no match for a night spent alone at 8,000 meters. where the temperature plummeted to nearly -40 degrees. His oxygen-deprived brain played tricks on him. The mountain became a stage for a surreal theater of the mind, a place where time unraveled and reason dissolved. As the hours dragged on, Lincoln knew his odds were slim, knew his family would be feeling the weight of his absence, and knew he had skirted death. But against reason, against the mountain itself, he was still breathing. The thin air at that altitude delivered only a third of the oxygen available at sea level. Each breath was a laborious act, a gasping attempt to stave off suffocation. Hall's lungs burned, his chest heaved, and yet his muscles screamed for more. The paradox of Everest was that even as he sat motionless, his body was burning energy at an unsustainable rate just to keep him alive. The mountain itself seemed alive, whispering to him in the stillness. It told him to lie down, to close his eyes, to let go. Everest, he knew, had claimed many climbers this way. The overwhelming urge to sleep, a final betrayal of the body's instinct for survival, was the last temptation. Hall fought it as best he could, shaking his head, rubbing his face, anything to stay conscious. And yet, there was something defiant in him, a stubborn ember of will that refused to be extinguished. Perhaps it was the image of his sons that kept him tethered to life, or the ingrained toughness of years spent climbing, pushing himself to the limits of human endurance. Whatever it was, it held him on the edge of existence through those long, agonizing hours. Lincoln clung to life on Everest while his family grieved back in Australia. His wife had drifted into a restless sleep when she dreamed of him, walking towards her, smiling. It was a peaceful vision, filling her with joy. But when she woke, the truth hit her hard. She felt cold, hollow, and could hear the soft, broken sobs of their oldest son through the walls. As dawn neared, Lincoln was slipping deeper into the clutches of death. The cold was numbing, seeping into his bones. And then, in horror, he realized what he wasn't feeling. His fingers. They were wooden, with frostbite, frozen solid. But worse signs were creeping in too. A wave of heat surged through him, and he began tearing at his clothes. Advanced hypothermia had taken hold, drawing him closer to death. At camp, Lincoln's friends honored him. "Hundreds have died on Everest, but it never seemed possible with Lincoln," they whispered. Meanwhile, in his delirium, he saw himself cloaked in warmth, a hallucination of comfort that felt like death itself. The thought hit him with brutal clarity. He would never see his family again. For a moment he felt he could give in, let himself go, but then he saw their faces, and love cut through the fog. Love wouldn't let him die. He knew he had to get back to them. 12 hours after he was left for dead, Lincoln was somehow still alive, though barely holding on. In his haze, he felt the earth beneath him and thought it impossible. The mountain seemed to move, tilting like he was on a ship at sea. His world blurred, slipping between reality and hallucinations. And then, by a stroke of chance, Everest guide Dan Mazur and his team stumbled upon him. The team consisted of team leader Mazur of the USA and UK, Andrew Brash of Canada, Miles Osborne of the UK, and Jangbu Sherpa of Nepal. Mazur, an experienced mountaineer with a reputation for pragmatism, led his small group towards safety. As they navigated the treacherous terrain, they spotted what they first thought was a body, a grim but not uncommon sight on Everest. But as they drew closer, the figure stirred. It was Lincoln Hall. The sight was surreal. Clad in a frost-covered down suit, Hall sat upright on the exposed ridge as though waiting for something or someone. His helmet was off, his gloves were missing, and his frost-bitten hands lay limply in his lap. His face, pale and gaunt, bore the unmistakable signs of extreme altitude sickness, but most hauntingly, he spoke. "I'm Lincoln Hall," he croaked, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I think I'm alive." It was the last day for climbers on the mountain. They expected to find Lincoln's body, not a man still breathing. Dan found him babbling about the fine weather for a cruise. He was barely holding on, hypothermic, the cerebral edema still swelling in his brain. Dan offered him oxygen and fed him chocolate to bring him back. Slowly, the world sharpened into focus. Lincoln was alive. Mazur and his team, 2 other climbers and a Sherpa, were stunned. They knew Hall's story. Word had spread the previous evening that he had been left for dead. Yet here he was, alive against all odds, clinging to life in the thin, hostile air of the death zone. Their immediate reaction was disbelief, followed by dread. Rescuing Hall would mean sacrificing their summit bid and risking their own lives in the process. At 8,000 meters, every decision carries enormous weight. Resources were scarce, their oxygen supplies were limited, and time was slipping away. To delay their descent was to gamble with their lives, yet leaving Hall was unthinkable. Mazur glanced at his team, reading the silent agreement in their weary faces. They would not abandon him. Mazur's team went to work on Lincoln, but he was incoherent, his sentences fragmented and his thoughts disjointed. Mazur knelt beside him, his voice calm and steady, coaxing Hall back to some semblance of awareness. They wrapped him in extra clothing, their own reserves of warmth now sacrificed to stave off hypothermia. They offered him water, though Hall's frozen hands fumbled with the bottle. Every movement was a struggle, every moment fraught with the understanding that time and oxygen were running out. The radio crackled to life. Mazur called base camp, relaying their discovery and requesting immediate assistance. The news crackled over the radio to base camp. Lincoln's alive. Mike Dillon and the others were stunned, still reeling from the report of his death. Now, processing this impossible truth of him being alive, they knew it was likely impossible for him to survive much longer. Rescue at that altitude was nearly impossible. Sherpas would be dispatched, but it could take hours, perhaps too long. Regardless, a team of Sherpas was mobilized, but they were 4 hours away. Meanwhile, Lincoln began slipping back into delirium, his mind clouded by the mountain's grip. He fought off his rescuers, pulled off his oxygen mask, and tried to go back up the mountain as if drawn by some dark magnet. Mazur's team stayed with Hall, each passing moment a test of endurance and resolve. They took turns talking to him, keeping him awake and engaged. The human mind, they knew, was as fragile as the body in such conditions, and Hall's tenuous grasp on reality needed to be preserved. Hall's condition fluctuated. One moment, he was lucid, recounting snippets of his life in Australia. The next, his eyes glazed over, and he seemed to drift toward the abyss. Mazur's team, despite their exhaustion, refused to let him go. They gave him the last of their oxygen, knowing full well it could mean sacrificing their own strength for his survival. As the hours dragged on, Mazur wrestled with the enormity of their decision. The summit, the ultimate prize for which they had risked so much, was now an impossibility. Everest was merciless in this regard. Climbing it was a balance of ambition and survival, and every climber knew the cost of losing that balance. Yet, in that moment, Mazur felt no regret. Hall's survival had become their summit. Finally, the Sherpas reached him, exhausted from the climb. Lincoln's life was now in their hands. The Sherpas arrived in the early afternoon, their faces stoic but determined. Their task was monumental, to move a near-dead man down the mountain's unforgiving slopes. As they prepared Hall for the journey, he turned to Mazur, his frost-bitten lips trembling. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. It was a moment of clarity, fleeting but profound. Mazur nodded, his own words caught in his throat. The team watched as the Sherpas began the painstaking task of dragging Hall down the mountain. Mazur and his climbers, their own oxygen reserves critically low, could not linger. They continued their descent, each step heavy with the weight of what they had witnessed and the knowledge that they had done the right thing. The Sherpas would have to push Lincoln to descend down the mountain on his own strength, or he would die. He was frail, collapsing every few steps into the snow. They had to get him down 7,000 feet or 2,000 meters to safety, while the mountain and the altitude worked against them. Nightfall brought a fresh dread. Lincoln was slipping, and with every hour the Sherpas were growing weaker too. But they pushed him hard, refusing to let him give in. At one point, one Sherpa raised his ice axe, prepared to do anything to keep him moving. After 10 hours, Lincoln's body was nearly giving out. Hypothermia and cerebral edema had taken their toll. He could go no further, but the Sherpas would not stop. With everything he had left, Lincoln clung to the thought of his family, that sliver of hope that kept his feet moving. He pushed forward, one staggering step at a time. Finally, he crested a small slope and knew it was over. He had survived. Relief washed over him, but he had nothing left for celebration. He called his wife, Barbara. When she heard his voice, hoarse and broken, she barely recognized it. But she knew it was him, and in that moment, it was a gift beyond words for her. Lincoln was helped by numerous people down Everest. He was treated for frostbite and cerebral edema as a result of altitude sickness while close to the summit. 10 deaths were reported on Everest in that 2006 season, close to the record of 12 during the 1996 spring climbing season. Mr. Hall's rescue has provided a bright spot days after a successful summiteer admitted that dozens of climbers aiming for the top had passed by a stricken British climber who would later die. Despite the extremely difficult ordeal, Hall was in relatively good shape, but he lost the tips of his fingers and a toe due to frostbite during his recovery in Australia. Lincoln Hall had come so close to losing it all, his family, his life, but he vowed never to put them through this again. The Sherpas who saved him had risked everything to get him down, and he would be forever grateful. Though frostbite had claimed the tips of his fingers and a toe, he recovered. He still rock climbed but would never attempt a major peak again. The mountain had taken him as far as any man could go, and he had returned. 6 years later, at the age of 56, Lincoln Hall passed away after suffering from mesothelioma, a type of cancer allegedly resulting from his exposure to asbestos in childhood. Mr. Hall's friend and Himalayan Foundation chairman Simon Balderstone was devastated by the loss, stating, "There were very few tougher, better climbers in the world and very few better people. Frankly, I'm grief-stricken. He was a dear friend, a simply wonderful human being, and a wonderful humanitarian. I guess I finally have to admit he wasn't invincible." In 1987, Mr. Hall was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for his service to mountaineering. He was survived by his wife, Barbara, and 2 sons. It may seem unfair and cruel that Lincoln Hall survived this nearly insurmountable experience on Everest, only to pass away 6 years later at a relatively young age. But those who knew him knew Lincoln fought for every extra day possible to spend with his family and friends. In a 2007 interview, Lincoln Hall discussed how he had always been attracted to the danger of mountain climbing, stating, "The experience is incredibly intense because it is so dangerous. There are the objective dangers, which are dangers you can't control, like avalanches, rockfalls, storms, hidden crevasses. And then there are the dangers within yourself. Mental fortitude, physical fortitude, your judgment, what your climbing partners happen to be doing, and how much time you've got left in the day. Juggling all those parameters. You become hyposensitized, and it's a level of living." The question is not whether Everest or any other peak can be climbed. Many have done it. The question is whether it is worth the price. And that answer, like the mountain itself, the mountain is a judge, silent and cold. It is there, vast and indifferent, and it will strip you bare if you dare to climb its face. Each step upward is a wager of flesh and bone against gravity and time, and the mountain takes its payment whether you reach the summit or not. If the storm comes, or the ice gives way, the mountain shows no mercy. You will find yourself alone, truly alone, with only the raw will to survive as your companion. That will is not forged in comfort or safety. It is born in the moments when the air burns your lungs, when your hands bleed against the rock, and when your mind whispers that you should quit, but you do not stop. You cannot quit. To survive on the mountain is to defy nature's indifference with your own stubbornness, your own refusal to vanish into the snow and stone. It is not about strength of body, though that helps. It is about strength of spirit, the kind that crawls when it cannot walk, that sees through darkness and despair, that pushes forward When there is no promise of rescue or relief, the mountain will not remember you. It does not care for your triumph or your tragedy, but if you survive, you will remember. And that is enough. To come down alive is to carry a piece of the mountain within you forever and never forget your outdoor disaster. If you've made it this far, please consider clicking those subscribe and like buttons. Want more outdoor disasters content? Check out these videos I believe you'll enjoy. Thank you for watching.